First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here in support of the YWCA and also in support of women. I feel very strongly that we're living in a time right now where women's power is on the rise, and that quality of connection, our awareness of relationship, is the focus that our world needs right now. In my experience in working with people from many, many different cultures around the world, particularly people from this land, the Aboriginal people in the Americas, talk about how we're in a time of giving birth right now to a new cycle, a new age. And it's the power of women that's really important during this time, because women have the secret of birth and how we give birth. So one of the other secrets that women have seemed to hold in history was not just birth, but death, and then renewal. And I have certainly found this to be the case in my own life. It's been quite interesting. Today happens to be the 4th month anniversary of my mother's death. She died June 28th. And in my tradition, which is the Jewish tradition, for a child of a parent or for a partner, we do special ceremonies on a monthly basis on the day that the person died. And I think it's just amazing that I happen to be here in support of women and in support of change on my mother's anniversary. So all of us have had the experience of losing loved ones, and the experience also of remembering those who have passed. It's in the power of remembering that we actually receive the blessings of those who are on the other side, while we're also then sending blessings to them as they travel through the worlds to the place of great peace and great happiness. And so I'd like us, if we can, just to take a moment and send out whatever prayers and blessings we might be asking for right now, perhaps to those who are no longer with us physically, or perhaps to our ancestors, or perhaps to people around the world who have died through trauma, through accident, through illness, through mass disaster, civil war. Just sending forth and remembering them. But none of us live in vain. Thank you. I remember in my own studies, one of the things, I'm a psychologist, but I also was psychic as a child, and started studying as many intuitive sciences as I possibly could when I was around 12 years old. And one of the things that I learned along the way is that there are different ways that we die. One is through the experience of death of the body, and another is through the experience of death of the soul. And then there's the experience of death of having been forgotten. So this little piece of remembering allows the spirit to be nourished through memory so that the energy of life continues on. In the traditions that I've studied, in the ancient mystery schools, they talked about how there are the greater mysteries and the lesser mysteries. And the death of the body is considered the lesser mystery, because that's something that we all go through at some point. The greater mystery is the death of the soul, how it is that we die and renew ourselves and come back to life while we're still in this body. And that has been the study of my life. In 1992, I wrote a book called Journey from Betrayal to Trust, and in 2001, I expanded on that in a book called Betrayal, Trust, and Forgiveness, which came out about a week before the Twin Towers were bombed, and the Pentagon, and 9/11. So that to me was like a cutoff point that opened up a whole change in our world. But it really had started before that. When I first wrote my book in 1992, the first 4 chapters were about how trauma and injury, personal betrayal wounds, are actually catalysts for our spiritual growth. And then I had what I called my vapor chapters, the ones that I knew, but I didn't have the evidence yet. And those were about betrayal of the body, betrayal of society, betrayal of the planet, which is now called climate change, by the way. It wasn't called that in 1992. And lo and behold, between the time I made my outline for the publisher and when I actually got the contract and started writing the book, I experienced an earthquake, a firestorm, evacuation from my home, shingles inside of my throat, which was really quite interesting. And the betrayal of society was something that, of course, I had familiarity with some of my clients during all of the layoffs that people were going through at that time. And what I became aware of is how every injury we've suffered actually trains us to come to a deeper truth within our being if we are able to heal the injury and pain. And we have the capacity to do that. In fact, what I've discovered from all of that is that universally this experience of trauma and tragedy, if we look at the mystery traditions and the legends and the stories around the world, they all talk about this capacity for the soul to go through something called a dark night of the soul. Anybody here ever experience a dark night of the soul? Anybody know what I'm talking about? This is something that to me is the teacher of our current time. We are going through that dark night, not just as individuals, but also as society and as culture. And it seems to me that the current edge of growth right now, because there's been, I think, enough of an edge where there are enough individuals who have found their way through that dark night, at least I meet them everywhere I go all over the world, that the next growth edge for us is how do we change our culture, change our institutions, change our group awareness? How do we relate to each other collectively now? That's the next edge that I'm noticing. And it seems to me that somehow in the course of my work, as I've let go into being willing to simply step forward in whatever way I can, I'm noticing that I've had opportunities to start working with groups in pretty significant ways. Not that I knew that that would be happening, mind you. One of the things that I've witnessed, at least in my own life, is that there's been this shift from having a goal and making things happen to kind of allowing life to happen and going with what's being presented. And I think of that as a very feminine approach to how we live in the world. We live in the world in a way that allows life to reveal itself instead of attempting to make life a particular way. I feel like we're going through a really massive paradigm shift right now, and I know I personally have been through several myself. So interestingly enough, I always ask for dreams, and I had a dream that what I needed to talk about this evening was about surrender and the experience of death and renewal. So I don't know how many of you may be going through some kind of a pivotal point where it's about letting go and allowing life to take you to whatever is next in your life. But I'm hoping that whatever it is I have to share can encourage you to take that risk of trusting yourself, trusting the wisdom within you, and trusting life, that life actually is larger than us and has a purpose, and we can find our relationship to that purpose. So let me see if I can. So my first explorations were in the 90s. I started finding this theme of how we move through a journey of growth and development that in the ancient worlds they called the journey of initiation or rite of passage. And there are 5 stages of growth that we go through. We go through first the experience of shock and separation, when something happens that we don't want to happen. And then we go through all kinds of tests and ordeals and trials. And in initiatory rites of passage, these are very specific, and they're designed to bring up all of your fears and anxieties so you can confront them and move on. And if you don't, no problem, it'll just kill you. But the point is that the death hopefully is symbolic, not an actual death. Ideally, that symbolic death leads us to a new awareness, new knowledge. And that new knowledge is something that we gain from inner resources through our intuition as opposed to outer resources. Now, in initiatory rites of passage, early phases and stages, there might be an outer teacher, somebody who will tell you, well, what is it to be a man and what is it to be a woman, and they'll teach you that. But when it comes to life being the teacher, we get the test first, then we get the teaching. And that teaching that we get comes from our own hearts as we discover what it means to us. How can I grow from whatever life is bringing me? How can I move forward? I was listening particularly to our first speaker and the tests and challenges that she has faced. And what I've discovered with each person that I've worked with is when we start asking, so how have you grown from this? What have you learned about yourself from this? We can always create value and meaning. That's because there's something extremely creative within us. And it's up to each of us to discover that creative source. And that's what leads to the symbolic renewal and rebirth. So, oddly enough, I was presenting this work and with the International Council of Psychologists, some of the work that I've done on betrayal, trust, and forgiveness, and particularly on healing racism between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal populations. And whoops, I don't want to go that far yet. And on December 26th, 2004, as all of you I'm sure are aware, there was a radical first massive natural disaster that struck our world. We've been having lots of them since because of the climate change issues that we're in the midst of right now. And one of the people at the International Council of Psychologists was a colleague of mine from Indonesia. So I called Monty and said, Monty, you know, how are you? What's happening? And he said, can you come and train recovery workers? Because there really wasn't a lot of information in the early 2000s. Now it's a whole industry, trauma recovery. But in the early 2000s, it was not an industry yet. And so I was invited to go to Indonesia. The first program I gave was at Jakarta, in Jakarta, because as you can see, Aceh, which lost 170,000 people that single day out of the 250,000 that were lost out of the 12 different countries that were hit. Aceh was only 5 minutes from the epicenter, so it was just demolished. We couldn't really do trainings in Aceh, so we did the trainings in Jakarta. Psychologists were brought there. And the programs that I did, I organized, what I developed into a spiritually directed therapy process. Because in Indonesia, people would certainly go to see a spiritual healer long before they would ever go to see a psychologist. So each of the phases of the journey of initiation were translated into ways that we can connect with our own inner healing, first and foremost. And frequently I would teach about breathing. And I'd like to invite you now just to take a few deep breaths. And if you breathe in to a count of 4 and out to a count of 4. Breathing in, 2, 3, 4, and out, 2, 3, 4. And if you keep doing that while I'm talking, you will change your biochemistry. Something that we've discovered is that the heart actually thinks. And when we breathe and change our breathing, we start sending forth oxytocin and taming the cortisol stress responses in the body. It also so happens that breath is one of those universal ways of connecting to spirit. Inspiration and expiration, it's even in the word when we say how to breathe. So I would teach first, how do we connect with our own spirits? Then how do we observe our stress reactions? I'm not going to go into all of this, but needless to say, as psychologists, there are specific things that we look for. The most important thing, though, is then how do we allow someone, how do we be with someone who's in radical stress to share their feelings? And how do we listen with our whole bodies, not just our ears, but with our heart and our souls? I call that embodied awareness. We then open intuitively to understand, to gain insight and meaning, and to assist another person in appreciating what it is that they have been through and how they can grow from that, so that they too can then begin to gain guidance. Particularly, each of us discovers what works for us in our own healing. And as we begin to do what helps us heal, we actually become a model or an example of healing in our communities. So this was the method that I was teaching, and I put out a prayer that someone in Jakarta, there would be one person who could help me take this work, if it was appropriate, to Aceh itself. And of course, one psychologist came up to me at the end of the program and said, I would love to bring you to Aceh. And so we arranged for me to go back to Aceh, and it took a while for everything to be arranged because things were in such distress there. I returned around the time of the anniversary of the tsunami. I discovered that Aceh at the time was in the middle of a civil war. And the good news of the tsunami was that it actually required people in Jakarta, the government, and people in Aceh to start working together. And because it's a very oil-rich, resource-rich part of Indonesia, there was a lot of motivation to get things up and running again. So actually, the tsunami brought the end of the civil war in Aceh, which I thought was just brilliant. So we worked with individuals, helping them identify what their triggers were, what were the tests and trials, the ordeals they were going through. And then each developed, I taught them a number of breathing exercises, and the recovery workers that I worked with there were all volunteer recovery workers and survivors themselves. And they learned a number of different techniques and came up with what worked for each of them individually. And then they kept track of how they felt afterwards. For example, in the case of worry, one of the participants did the ujjayi breath and felt refreshed. Another might have felt lonely and read the Quran and felt hopeful and peace again. In the fate, now there were lots of earthquakes, for continuing even still in Indonesia because it's part of the Ring of Fire. So when earthquakes happened, using a sniffing breath and feeling calmed, or feeling sad and tired, just looking at the night sky and feeling, again, inspired and peaceful and calm again. Each person did their own way. And these are just a few examples of what people ended up being able to do. For example, Alina here, when her legs were numb because she had been injured in the earthquake, she used the ujjayi breath, and it made her feel better because she knew the energy in the breath plus the blood circulation helped her feel better. That's just an example. This is another person, Nova. This was everybody who we trained was trained to train others. So this is what was different about the work that I do in the places that I've had the opportunity. Is it's not just about training, helping people, but training others to actually help others in their communities. So this is a really good example. So Nova was doing the breathing exercises, and I'll read what she said here. It's useful for me and for others as our bodies felt fresh and more comfortable, especially if we did it routinely. Our body feels calm and light. Inshallah, thanks be to God. I teach my students, the ujjayi and stabilizing breath and energy transfer I taught to my close relatives, my sister, brother, and good friends. So I'm just going to go forward here. And basically, I ended up presenting my work. I did a T-test, and we also found evidence, in fact, where people did these practices for 90 days, and we tested to see how much their stress reactions decreased, and lo and behold, there was a significant reduction in stress, which I presented at a conference, and that conference brought me an invitation, which was quite a surprise to me, to present this work at the first ever body, mind, spirit practices for the reduction of human rights violations in recovery. So that was, really something that I had never anticipated in my entire life, that I would end up having an opportunity to share work in such an august group of people. Interestingly enough, from that, I don't quite know exactly how this one happened, but one of the journalists that I worked with at one time, who interviewed me, ended up working with Mariatu Kamara. I don't know if I can make a little, that's Mariatu right here. She's a double amputee from Sierra Leone, where people were receiving justice by having their arms cut off. And you might have seen Blood Diamonds, the movie. Anyway, Susan invited me as a journalist to travel with Mariatu, who had become the child ambassador of UNICEF to Sierra Leone. And we traveled around together as Susan was helping Mariatu write her autobiography. Mariatu was dedicated to forgiveness. For example, what she came to after all of this, that the children soldiers who had injured her, and this is her quote, "The anger made me sick, and over time I saw that taking a life was not the solution. They were kids like me who'd got caught up in something beyond their control." So this capacity to gain a larger point of view, and she then saw that her purpose was actually to bring forgiveness and to help others understand that we can forgive something even as atrocious as that. Now, having worked also with Native communities in this culture and building bridges, one of the biggest things is how do we begin to address issues of racism and colonialism and the after effects of colonialism. I was just this last week up working with Native youth from Fort McMurray. The suicide rate is 7 times higher for Native youth than it is for other youth in our culture. So there's a lot that I could say about that, but the hardest thing is what's called lateral violence. If we've been oppressed, we have a tendency to create a pecking order in our own communities. And so the experience of how do we begin to address these issues and how do we of privilege start doing things that can help others. And I just have a few things from one of my Unlearning Racism workshops where everybody stepped forward during the empowerment phase and identified different things that they could do. So some of them became things like, on a mental level, I will teach my stepdaughter the importance of family. I will teach her why racism is hurtful and destroying. I will teach her to love herself as a result of being grounded and steadfast. How important it is to be honest. On a spiritual level, another participant said, be thine own light, draw from your own spirit. From the emotional way, actions that we can take, listen to others. I will use my power, wisdom, and knowledge to continue to strengthen my core and release my fears. So when we start making a commitment to ourselves, we start thinking about what can we do that will make a difference for others. Haiti was another one. It's like, I never knew that I would be doing these things, but invitations start coming and my whole body would say yes. Now it so happened also in 2010, my husband in September, this was in January, ended up being diagnosed with leukemia, and my mother started getting ill, and I already had commitments for the next 2 years, so I had to start finding ways of adapting so that I could address my personal life while at the same time addressing my calling. And I'm happy to say that this has opened a new chapter for me as well. I took a colleague of mine with me to Haiti, Kim Haxton. She's a First Nations ceremonialist and facilitator. And I was in Haiti with her during 2010 and 2011. In 2012, she went on her own, and she's now in Congo developing programs for women and women training women to help other women and their children, which is, she's just amazing. So needless to say, we are not without disasters here in our own community. By 2012, I had finally made it back home here to Calgary. I'd been to Japan on the anniversary of Fukushima and a few other travels that year. 2013, no travel. And lo and behold, in my own backyard, this is my finger, we live right here on the river, I also was impacted by our local disaster. And that has given me many opportunities to help with the local community. One of my other mentees now is assisting with that. Even running groups, tonight is her first group. So the thing that I think is really important that I want to leave you with is I'd like each of you to think about when you have had a trauma, a crisis, and how it's been actually an opening or an awakening for you. What positive gifts have you received as a result of what you've been through? How have you grown? And how have you shared what you've learned with others? And make a commitment today on one thing that you can do to empower someone else to discover their own strength as they face life's challenges, as life takes them by the hand and teaches them to discover their own inner strength. Thank you.